What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
During my daughter's engagement party, the room already had that tight, showy energy families get when old history and new rings try to sit at the same table. And before I even found a place to put my purse, her stepmother leaned in with a pleasant voice that had an edge like a lid on a pot, telling me that my place was in the corner because he would do the toast, and I felt the kind of heat that climbs up the neck and dares you to make a scene. Yet I swallowed it down because the one thing I was not going to do was hand anyone a story where I ruined my daughter's night. I stood where she told me to stand, which she thought was the point, and I watched the way my ex straightened his shoulders like a man about to collect a prize he did not earn. And I watched my daughter's smile wobble for a second the way it does when she knows two worlds are about to scrape against each other, and I let it all wash over me like a cold shower, steadying my breath. Because I have learned that the person who can hold a silence without flinching usually walks out with the truth. And the truth is always louder than a microphone. He cleared his throat and made it theatrical, and she hovered close enough to be seen inside the frame of his importance, and the crowd did that polite laugh families do when they want to show they are good sports even when they are not, and I stayed put, hands together, nodding like a church usher, thinking about all the times I had been told to take the smaller chair, the back row, the later call, and how many of those moments I had eaten just to keep peace, because I am a mother before I am anything else, and mothers swallow storms so their children can finish a plate of food. I caught the event coordinator's eye because every party has a person who understands power in practical terms like timing and sound checks and dessert arrival, and I asked her quietly if there was a way to make sure my daughter got a moment to speak in her own party, not to fight a war, not to fix the past, just to let the person at the center be the person at the center. And she nodded in that efficient way people nod when you give them a job that makes the evening better, and I slipped her a folded bill and a thank you with a look that said the rest. So when his speech ended, and her stepmother moved like she was about to glide into whatever came next, the coordinator took the microphone and announced, with that cheerful authority people trust when holding a clipboard, that before anyone else spoke, the bride would like to say a few words to the people who raised her, and I watched the quick flash across the stepmother's face, the calculation of whether to block this or smile through it, and I watched my ex's mouth tighten just a bit, and I watched my daughter hold the mic with both hands like it was heavier than it looked, and in that moment, without me needing to step out of my corner, the center of the room shifted back to where it belonged. My daughter thanked everyone, and she did it carefully, calling her father steady, calling his wife organized, and then she turned to me and said a simple thing that ripped the tablecloth off the whole act, telling the room that the person who taught her how to breathe through hard conversations was me, and that the reason she could stand and speak for herself was because I never spoke over her. And the applause that followed was not loud enough to embarrass anyone, but exactly loud enough to land the message, and I let my eyes sting for a second, because it felt like finally someone who mattered stamped the document I had been carrying for years. The stepmother did not meet my eyes after that, and she did not have to, because I already had what I came for, which was not attention or revenge or a trophy. It was the reminder that I do not need permission to be my daughter's mother. And I do not need a microphone to be heard by the only person whose hearing matters, and I kept that smile small because I knew the smarter play was to leave it there, take my quiet win, and not dance on it. I left before the final round of congratulations because I had seen enough and because good exits are a kind of discipline, and while I rode home I replayed the entire evening like a coach with a marker, not to torture myself but to map the field. And when my phone buzzed with a subject line from the venue that I knew I was not supposed to see, a forwarded invoice threaded with a short note from her to my ex about a card limit and a deposit that had bounced, I read it twice and felt the floor tilt under the whole performance, and I realized that the night had given me more than a moment at the mic. It had handed me the first clean lever, which I held without replying, because sometimes the best answer is the one you save for later. When I woke up the morning after the engagement party, the first thing I felt was not pride, even though my daughter had thanked me in front of everyone in a way that made my chest tighten with a mix of relief and vindication, but rather the heaviness of knowing that to the rest of the room, especially to my ex-husband's wife, I still looked like the woman who had been told to stand in the corner and had actually obeyed, because appearances carry more weight in families than truths. And in this family, I had learned that the narrative was always written by whoever spoke the loudest or smiled the widest, even if they were drowning beneath the surface. I made coffee, sat at the table, and scrolled through the photos people had already posted online, and the one that burned itself into me was a picture where my ex-husband stood tall, glass raised, his wife clutching his arm with that smug little tilt of the chin she wore like jewelry, and in the blurred background you could just see me near the corner of the frame, small and slightly turned away, as if the photographer had captured exactly the version of the story she wanted told. The powerful couple in the spotlight, the mother who didn't matter shrinking into the shadows, and I let the bitterness run through me but not out of me, because if I've learned anything, it's that people who explode in public usually end up cleaning up the pieces while the people who humiliated them walk away clean. Still, all day I couldn't shake the image, and it wasn't just vanity, it was the fear that my daughter, who has always been quick to defend the weaker side, might look at those photos later and start to believe them. Because repetition has a way of turning lies into accepted facts, and I would not, let myself become the character they were scripting, the quiet, sidelined ex-wife whose importance was now limited to a polite acknowledgement in speeches. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many times silence had been taken for weakness in my life, and not just at family events, but in courtrooms where I kept my mouth shut because my lawyer told me patience would serve me better. Or at school meetings where I let my ex-husband's wife ramble about her organizational skills while I sat still. Or at birthdays where I handled the cleanup while she handled the spotlight, and though I knew deep down that silence is a form of discipline, I also knew that to people like her, it looked like surrender. And yet, beneath all that reflection was something harder, sharper, and strangely comforting. The memory of that forwarded invoice I had opened the night before, the one that showed a deposit bounced back on her card. A reminder that while she may know how to pose for pictures and deliver cutting little lines meant to sting, she was not as flawless as she wanted everyone to think, because cracks don't show in the spotlight until someone takes the time to look for them. And I had just been handed my first proof that her power was not real marble but painted plaster. Over the next week, I kept my head down and played the role I knew everyone expected. The mother who was supportive but peripheral, the woman who smiled politely when plans were announced without her input, the one who simply nodded when told the bridal shower would be handled by the stepmother because she's so organized, and I bit back every retort because I wanted to see how far they would push it, how much rope they would spool out, before they realized who was holding the scissors. Every interaction was like a test, and each time I passed it by saying less, I felt myself pulling further back emotionally from the trap of arguing or demanding space, and instead I started observing like a scientist collecting data, listening to the way my daughter sometimes slipped when she spoke about the wedding budget, or how my ex bragged a little too loudly about the deals he was supposedly closing, and how his wife constantly circled back to talking about appearances, guest lists, and how things would look in photographs, almost as though the show itself was the marriage, and the marriage was just another backdrop. By the end of that week, when I was putting away groceries and saw a message pop up in a family group chat that looked innocuous, a reminder about finalizing payments for the venue, I caught the subtle hesitation in my daughter's reply. A little pause before she said, "We're on track," and I realized she was smoothing over something she didn't want me to see. But I had already learned to pay attention to those small cracks, because they were the beginnings of the unraveling rope, and while they thought I was sitting in the corner waiting for permission, I was already building the map in my head of where the floor might give way. And in that quiet kitchen, phone still in my hand, I promised myself that the next time I was underestimated, it would be by design and not by accident, and that the silence I carried would not be mistaken for weakness again. Because when the moment came to act, and I knew it would come, it would be with a move they never saw coming, and I smiled to myself as I shut off the light, knowing that my patience was no longer about survival, but about strategy, and that made all the difference. The following weeks rolled forward with the usual chatter about seating arrangements, caterers who had to be booked before some imaginary deadline, and endless conversations in which my ex-husband's wife acted as though she were the sole general of a campaign that could not possibly succeed without her oversight, and while I sat through all of it without once challenging her authority in front of others, my mind was already cataloging the inconsistencies that slipped through the polished surface she worked so hard to maintain, because the truth about people who crave control is that they reveal their weaknesses in the very process of trying to appear flawless. One evening, I drove my daughter home from a dress fitting, and in that quiet space where she always seemed to let her guard down, she admitted that the budget felt tighter than anyone was willing to acknowledge. That her father had promised her the moon but somehow managed to sound evasive every time the topic of final payments came up, and that her stepmother had been oddly stressed about credit limits while simultaneously posting pictures online about how lavish everything would be, and I listened carefully, nodding at all the right moments, not pushing her, not inserting my opinion, just absorbing the fact that the perfect picture they had tried to paint in front of everyone else was beginning to show its first visible cracks. I knew better than to gloat or even hint that I was aware of the weakness, because the fastest way to lose leverage is to let your opponent know you're holding it. So instead, I reassured my daughter that things would work out, that she shouldn't stress herself to the point of spoiling what was supposed to be the happiest period of her life, and then I filed away her confession as quietly as I had saved the invoice that revealed a bounced deposit, because those pieces of information together told me what I needed to know. They were overextended, pretending to be secure, and far more fragile than they wanted anyone to believe. From that point on, I started paying closer attention, not just to words, but to body language, to the nervous laughter that broke out when my ex's wife overexplained a simple logistical detail, to the way my ex avoided eye contact whenever talk turned to money, and to the fact that my daughter, perceptive as she is, seemed caught in a tug-of-war between loyalty to the people funding her party and quiet faith that I could step in if needed. Though she never said it aloud, perhaps because she didn't want to seem disloyal. I began showing up in small, calculated ways that shifted the balance without sparking open conflict, bringing homemade food to planning sessions so my daughter wouldn't collapse from exhaustion, paying discreetly for alterations when I overheard that the dress shop required full payment before pickup, and even contacting a florist under the guise of helping choose centerpieces while making sure the deposit actually cleared on my card without announcing it to anyone, because my goal was not to humiliate them in the moment, but to ensure that when the real cracks widened, my daughter would see who had quietly kept everything from falling apart. There was a certain satisfaction in watching them pose as masters of the event while I slipped behind the scenes patching the holes they could not admit were there. And the irony was not lost on me that the woman who once told me to stand in the corner had no idea that I was now the invisible scaffolding holding up her performance, though I never once asked for recognition, because I knew recognition would come at the right time and in a way she could not stop. The real turning point came late one night when my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, it was her voice, tight with panic, asking me if I had a moment to talk, and though every instinct told me to let it go to voicemail, curiosity made me stay on the line, listening to her circle around the subject before finally blurting out that a payment deadline had been missed and that the venue was threatening to release the date if it wasn't resolved immediately, and in that moment I felt the tables shift in a way that almost made me laugh, though I kept my voice even, pretending I was surprised but not gloating, because it was not yet the moment to reveal anything. I told her calmly that she should speak with my ex about it, that it wasn't really my place, and I could hear the hesitation in her silence before she tried to soften her tone, almost pleading, saying she thought maybe I could help just this once for the sake of our daughter, and I knew right then that whatever image she had built of herself as the gatekeeper of power was starting to crumble under the weight of bills and expectations she couldn't carry. And it took every ounce of restraint not to deliver the sharp response I wanted to give, because I understood that real satisfaction doesn't come from saying "I told you so" too early, but from waiting until the moment when the whole picture collapses and everyone sees what you already knew. So I ended the call politely, wished her good luck, and put down the phone, my heart racing not with anger, but with the electric thrill of knowing that the leverage I had quietly collected was about to matter more than anything they had paraded in front of me. And as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that silence was no longer a shield I hid behind, but a weapon I was finally ready to use. The morning the dam broke, my phone burrowed under the pillow like it was trying to hide from the noise, and when I finally pulled it out, I saw a stack of voice notes from her that looked like a falling tower. Each one labeled with the same frantic plea where she said she was sorry for the tone at the party, sorry for how it might have come across, sorry for the misunderstanding about the toast, and then she slid fast into the part that mattered, whispering through little breaths that the venue had issued a final notice, that the caterer wanted confirmation by the end of the day, that the photographer was threatening to release the date if the retainer remained in limbo, and that she needed me because I had a better relationship with our daughter and could smooth this over, which, translated out of her careful performance voice, meant she needed my card, my credibility, and my silence, and she needed them now. I listened once, then twice, then a third time, not because I enjoyed the sound of someone who had shoved me into a corner now begging me to stand in the doorway, but because I was measuring exactly where the leverage lived. And it turned out it was not only in the bounce deposit or the missed deadline, it was in the way these vendors operated under a very simple rule that I had learned during years of managing chaos for other people, which is that the person who pays becomes the person who holds the keys, and keys are more powerful than speeches. So while she was flooding my inbox with a kind of crying that doubles as manipulation, I opened a notebook, drew a quick map of the contracts, and started making calls with a calm, warm tone that said I was the adult who could be counted on when Instagram energy collapsed into real life. I called the venue first and asked about the status, as if I were simply clarifying details, and the manager, who had the steady voice of a woman who has seen every kind of family storm, confirmed that a payment had been declined twice and that they were on the edge of releasing the date, so I told her I would place a hold for a modest amount to secure the booking while we sorted the rest, and I asked, very gently, whether their policy allowed the billing contact to become the primary decision maker for timeline approvals and vendor access, and when she said yes, I gave the card, received the confirmation, and requested that all future approvals require both my sign-off and my daughter's. Not because I wanted to hoard power, but because I wanted to make sure the person at the heart of this event could not be pushed out by people who love the optics more than the commitment. I repeated the process with the caterer, the florist, and the photographer, not grandstanding, not announcing anything in the family chat, just steady, boring, decisive little moves that, when added up, changed the shape of the whole structure. And within an hour my inbox filled with a different kind of message, the automated alerts that say primary contact updated, authorization required from the mother of the bride, and I sat back with a long breath that tasted like clean air, because this was not about revenge for the sake of revenge. This was about restoring balance by using the tools they had handed me when they decided to treat the wedding as a brand launch rather than a promise. She must have received the alerts at the same time, because the next wave of voice notes arrived louder, the tears thicker now, the words tumbling over each other as she told me she had always respected me, that she understood emotions were high, that we both wanted what was best for our girl, and she begged me not to complicate things by changing roles at this late stage, which made me laugh out loud in my kitchen, not because it was funny, but because the nerve of asking me not to complicate things while standing on a mess she had created without telling the truth to my daughter felt like the kind of irony that only shows up when the universe is tired of watching you play small. I finally recorded one message back, and I kept my tone even and careful, telling her that from this moment forward I would handle vendor approvals in tandem with my daughter, that payments would be coordinated directly with me, that there would be no public drama and no scenes, that the event would proceed smoothly because I had already secured the timeline, and that she should take this as a relief rather than a punishment, since it freed her to focus on what she was best at, which was smiling for photos and telling people where to sit, and before I hit send I listened to it one more time to make sure there was not a single extra drop of heat in it, because the cold edge of policy is more devastating than any speech. The revenge, if you insist on calling it that, landed not with yelling but with a system email she could not argue with, and when my ex called seconds later with the question he always asks when his world blinks, which is whether I can fix this one last time, I told him that everything was already fixed and that all he needed to do was show up on time and keep his card in his pocket unless asked, which left him quiet in that guilty way he gets when the show is over, and as I ended the call I thought that this, right here, was the new center of the room, not the corner, not the microphone, but the quiet desk where all the doors get assigned. I was about to make a pot of tea when a final note arrived, not from her but from my daughter, a short line that said she had just gotten a strange call from the venue saying the contact had been changed and asking whether this was what she wanted. And before I could reply, she sent another message that said her stepmother had told her there was a serious issue she needed to tell me about the fiancé and that she should not trust me with the contracts until they had spoken, which is when I felt the floor tilt and realized this was not just about money or parties anymore, and that whatever card the woman had been holding back was about to be thrown on the table with both hands. When my daughter called with that jitter in her voice and said her stepmother had told her there was a serious issue about the man she was about to marry and that I should not be trusted with contracts until they spoke, I felt the old anger rise the way a bruise remembers a fist. Yet I kept my tone low and steady and asked if we could sit together with him present and listen to whatever needed to be said on speaker so that no one would have to pass messages like teenagers after a rumor at lunch. And she agreed, which told me she was scared but still open to the one thing that always saves a family from liars, which is daylight. So that evening we sat around my small table with 3 mugs that went cold. And I asked her to call the woman and simply let her talk, and talk she did, spinning out a story about alleged debts and secret meetings and a text that supposedly proved the groom had asked her to help manage the wedding money because I was emotional and could not be trusted. And when she finally stopped, I did not argue or defend myself or fling accusations. I only asked for the original message to be forwarded with headers intact, and the pause on the other end felt like a curtain catching fire in slow motion. He leaned in then, the man my daughter chose, and said he had never sent such a thing, and that if anything he had been pressured for weeks to route all planning through her because she knows how these things work. And he took out his phone and scrolled until he found the thread where she had suggested he discourage me from meddling. And he handed the screen to my daughter, who read in silence, while I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder I had prepared that afternoon after the venue's manager, a very practical woman who kept notes, emailed me call logs and timestamps of a cancellation request that had come from the stepmother's number with a shaky story about the couple taking a pause. And I pushed the printouts across the table like a mechanic laying out parts from a bad engine, not for drama, not for revenge fireworks, just for truth that did not need adjectives. I told my daughter that the vendors were now secured with payments made and that any attempt to alter dates or contacts would require dual approval from the bride and the mother whose card had cleared. And I said it in the same tone I use for doctor instructions or mortgage papers, and she looked at me with that complicated gratitude adult children feel when they realize you have been protecting them without asking for applause. Then she asked me why I had not told her sooner about the bounced deposit or the late notices, and I admitted that I had wanted to give the people who loved the performance a chance to act like adults before I took away the stage, which made her laugh in that wet way people laugh when they are choosing relief over rage. We called the stepmother back on speaker, and I told her we had the call log from the venue, the vendor confirmations, the text thread, and the forwarded screenshot she had just sent that did not contain the original headers. And I said I was not asking for explanations because explanations at this point would only be new stories stapled to old ones, and I laid out a simple, clean path forward that would let her save face without touching another wire, saying she could attend as a guest and smile for the photos and dance and be part of the day, but she would not be calling vendors, would not be approving anything, would not be delivering any toasts, and would not be inserting herself into the center of a room that did not belong to her. And I made sure my voice did not shake because when you give someone terms like that, you cannot afford a tremor. My ex called 5 minutes later with that careful tone men use when they suspect the ground has shifted and they do not know where to step, and I told him that everything was paid and scheduled and calm, and that the woman he chose had tried to cancel his daughter's date and smear her fiancé to claw back control, and that he could show up in a suit and clap and take pictures and stand where he was asked, or he could stay home and send a card. And he breathed loudly into the phone as if his lungs wanted to fight, but his calendar did not, and he said he would be there and would keep things simple, which is all I had ever wanted and never thought I would hear from him. The rehearsal dinner came, and I did not make a speech because I did not need to. I simply handed the microphone to my daughter first and watched her thank everyone, and then, with a level voice that made me proud in a way that hurt, lay out the new rule that only she and I would handle logistics and that anyone who called a vendor would be politely ignored by policy, and she did not name names. She did not cut anyone in front of strangers. She just changed the air in the room with one sentence. And if the stepmother looked smaller, it was because the chair she had tried to make mine now fit her exactly, and when the coordinator asked for final signatures, my daughter and I signed together while the woman who once told me my place was the corner stood a little off to the side typing on her phone, which did not ring. On the wedding day, I stayed away from the center on purpose, not because I was banished, but because I had built a center that did not need defending, and when I finally checked my phone that night, I saw the old thread of voice notes, starting with please and ending with need and circling through 100 excuses, and I archived the entire chain without replying because sometimes the sharpest revenge is not the public victory, but the quiet administrative act that enforces your boundary without a speech. And as I turned out the light, I thought about that corner she tried to send me to and realized it had become a small, locked office where the doors are assigned and the keys are labeled, and if I kept one for myself, it was not out of pettiness, but because I had finally learned the difference between being silent to survive and being silent to win, which, in the end, is what saved the day and closed the book without me having to raise my voice even once.